February 23, 1945. Iwo Jima. Major Robert McNamara pressed his hands against the cold metal desk in his Guam office, staring at reconnaissance photographs that refused to make sense. Tokyo still stands. Despite months of high-altitude precision bombing, despite thousands of tons of explosives dropped from 30,000 feet, the Japanese war machine continued functioning. The photographs showed factory districts intact, residential areas sheltering war workers undamaged, morale unbroken. Through the window, he could see B-29 Superfortresses returning from another mission, their crews exhausted, their bomb bays empty, their impact negligible. Something fundamental had to change. What McNamara and the statistical analysts of the 20th Air Force would discover in the coming weeks was that every assumption about strategic bombing had missed one critical factor. Japanese cities were not Berlin or Hamburg. They were wooden. And the United States had developed a weapon specifically designed to exploit that vulnerability. The M69 incendiary cluster bomb would transform American strategic doctrine overnight, unleashing firestorms that killed more civilians in single nights than the atomic bombs would months later. The weapon responsible emerged from a 1942 chemical warfare study that reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Standard incendiary bombs were ineffective against Japanese urban construction. The typical M50 thermite bomb, devastating against European masonry, simply burned through wooden roofs and extinguished itself on dirt floors below. The specifications demanded seemed almost sadistic. A weapon that could ignite would rapidly spread fire through entire neighborhoods, resist all firefighting efforts, and be delivered in massive quantities. What emerged from Standard Oil laboratories in New Jersey was ingenious and terrifying in equal measure. The M69 weighed just 6.2 pounds but contained napalm gel that burned at 2000 degrees Fahrenheit for up to 10 minutes. Its genius lay in the cluster delivery system. The E-46 cluster bomb contained 38 individual M69 bomblets that separated at 2,000 feet altitude, raining down across a 2,000-foot-long impact zone. Each B-29 could carry 40 cluster bombs, delivering 1,520 individual fire starting points per aircraft. The mathematics of urban destruction had been perfected. Production began in early 1943 at chemical plants across America. By February 1945, factories were producing 50,000 M69 bomblets daily. Each cost $1.80 to manufacture, a fraction of the $650 high-explosive bombs. The economic logic was inescapable. For the cost of one traditional bomb, the Air Force could deliver 360 incendiary bomblets across 6 city blocks. American industrial efficiency had weaponized fire itself. The 314th Bombardment Wing under Brigadier General Thomas Power received the first large-scale shipment of M69 cluster bombs in January 1945. Power, a hard-driving officer who believed in total war, immediately recognized their potential. Unlike his superior Curtis LeMay, who would later take credit, Power had been advocating low-altitude incendiary raids for months. The strategic logic was compelling. Japanese cities consisted of densely packed wooden structures, paper walls, tatami mat floors. Fire prevention systems were primitive, relying on neighborhood bucket brigades and limited water supplies. Most importantly, war production was dispersed throughout residential areas in small workshops and cottage industries. You could not separate military from civilian targets because they were integrated. The test raid on Tokyo's industrial suburbs on February 25, 1945, validated every horrific prediction. 74 B-29s flew at 7,000 feet, far below the normal bombing altitude, dropping M69 cluster bombs across a 1 square mile area. The result exceeded all projections. Over 27,000 structures burned. 1 square mile of Tokyo ceased to exist. Post-raid reconnaissance showed something unprecedented in air warfare history. The fires had not simply destroyed buildings. They had created a phenomenon meteorologists called a firestorm, where massive fires generate their own weather systems. Superheated air rises rapidly, creating powerful updrafts that pull in surrounding oxygen, feeding the flames with hurricane-force winds. Ground temperatures exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Asphalt streets liquefied. Metal tools melted. Human bodies were reduced to ash shadows on pavement. General Curtis LeMay, commanding 20th Air Force, studied the results with cold calculation. The test had proven what statistical analysis predicted. Low-altitude incendiary raids could destroy Japanese cities with minimal American casualties. The B-29s flying low burned less fuel, carried more bombs, achieved greater accuracy, and faced reduced fighter opposition since Japanese defenses were optimized for high-altitude interception. On March 9, 1945, LeMay made the decision that would define the Pacific Air War. 334 B-29 Superfortresses would attack Tokyo with nothing but M69 incendiary cluster bombs in the largest fire raid in human history. Operation Meetinghouse would demonstrate American airpower's ultimate evolution from precision bombing to total urban destruction. The air crews received their briefing with stunned silence. They would fly at 5,000 to 7,000 feet, far lower than ever attempted over Japan. Defensive armament would be removed to increase bomb capacity. Each aircraft would carry approximately 7 tons of M69 cluster bombs. The target was downtown Tokyo, the most densely populated square mileage on Earth, home to over 1 million people. Some crews protested. This was not strategic bombing of military targets. This was deliberate annihilation of civilian population centers. LeMay's response was brutal in its honesty. Japanese war production was dispersed throughout residential areas. Workers building airplane parts in their homes were legitimate targets. Total war meant exactly that. Every Japanese civilian supporting the war effort was complicit. The mission would proceed. Pathfinder aircraft equipped with radar bombing systems would mark the target area with napalm-filled M47 bombs, creating a burning X visible for miles. Follow-on bombers would use this aiming point to saturate the entire district. The plan called for 3 waves attacking over 6 hours, giving fires time to develop and merge. Meteorological reports predicted strong winds that night, perfect conditions for firestorm development. At 5:30 p.m. on March 9, the first B-29s lifted off from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. The aerial armada represented American industrial might at its apex. Each bomber cost $640,000, employed 11 crew members, burned fuel at 225 gallons per hour, and carried destruction sufficient to obliterate entire neighborhoods. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor with 353 aircraft. America responded with an air force that could darken the sky. The Pathfinder aircraft arrived over Tokyo at 12:15 a.m. on March 10. Anti-aircraft fire was moderate, Japanese defenses surprised by the low altitude. The lead bombardier released his M47 napalm bombs, creating a burning cross pattern in the Shitamachi district, Tokyo's working-class eastern neighborhoods. What followed was mechanized apocalypse. Wave after wave of B-29s flew over the burning X, releasing their cluster bombs in precise intervals. Thousands of M69 bomblets tumbled through the night sky, their small parachutes deploying at 2,000 feet, spreading the weapons across maximum area. Each bomblet's firing mechanism ignited upon impact, spraying napalm gel that adhered to wood, cloth, and human flesh. The fires started individually but merged within minutes. By 1 a.m., conflagrations were visible from 100 miles away. By 2 a.m., the firestorm had fully developed. Survivors described hell made manifest on Earth. Staff Sergeant Sam Motto, tail gunner on the B-29 Shamrock Special, later testified, looking down was like staring into a blast furnace. The entire city was one gigantic flame. We could feel the heat at 6,000 feet. The updrafts tossed our aircraft like toys. I saw people in the streets, tiny figures running, then disappearing into smoke. I threw up in my oxygen mask. The firestorm's physics created conditions incompatible with human survival. Winds reaching 100 miles per hour tore people from their hiding places, hurling them into flames. The fire consumed oxygen faster than breathing could replace it. Many died from asphyxiation before flames reached them. Canal water boiled. Underground shelters became ovens, cooking occupants alive. Those who jumped into water to escape the heat were boiled or crushed by others seeking the same refuge. Masako Harino, 19 years old, survived by submerging in a canal with only her face above water for 6 hours. The surface was covered with floating corpses, she recalled decades later. I had to push bodies aside to breathe. The air itself was fire. My hair burned away. My skin blistered. I watched children burning like torches, screaming for mothers who were already dead. Hell is not a metaphor. I lived there on March 10, 1945. The bombing continued until 3:30 a.m. By then, over 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs had been dropped. Approximately 500,000 individual M69 bomblets had ignited across 16 square miles. The Shitamachi district, home to 1.2 million people in one of Earth's most densely populated areas, had been deleted from existence. American losses were remarkably light. 14 B-29s were lost, mostly to mechanical failure or collision in smoke. Japanese fighter response was minimal, anti-aircraft fire scattered. The low-altitude gamble had succeeded completely. For the cost of 154 American lives, the attack had killed an estimated 100,000 Japanese civilians in a single night. When dawn broke on March 10, reconnaissance aircraft photographed a landscape transformed into moonscape. 16 square miles of urban area had been reduced to ash and rubble. The fires burned for 4 days afterward. The death toll exceeded both atomic bombings combined. The Sumida River was clogged with corpses. Hospitals were overwhelmed with burn victims who would die slowly over days and weeks. The sweet-sick smell of burned human flesh hung over Tokyo for a month. The Japanese government, initially attempting to suppress information, could not hide destruction on this scale. Radio Tokyo broadcast carefully worded reports acknowledging severe damage from indiscriminate terror bombing. But internal documents revealed complete panic. The Home Ministry calculated that if Americans continued raids at this intensity, every major Japanese city would be destroyed within 6 months. There was no defense. The psychological impact proved as devastating as physical destruction. Japanese civilians had been assured that their cities were safe, that American bombers targeted only military installations, that the homeland would never face direct attack. Operation Meetinghouse shattered those comfortable lies. If Tokyo itself could be incinerated in a single night, nowhere was safe. Morale began its terminal collapse. The strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities accelerated immediately. The March 9 success validated LeMay's doctrine completely. Between March 10 and August 15, 1945, American B-29s conducted 31 major incendiary raids against Japanese urban centers. Osaka burned on March 13, 14,000 dead. Nagoya burned on March 19, 2,000 dead. Kobe burned on March 16, 8,000 dead. Yokohama burned on May 29, 7,000 dead. The pattern repeated with industrial efficiency. Each raid followed the same methodology. Low-altitude approach. Cluster bomb saturation. Firestorm development. Total urban destruction. The M69 incendiary bomb proved phenomenally cost-effective. For approximately $3 million in munitions, the March 9 Tokyo raid destroyed $1 billion in property and infrastructure while killing 100,000 workers. No high-explosive bombing campaign could approach that return on investment. The economic logic of total war favored maximum civilian casualties. American war planners explicitly calculated optimal death ratios. Statistical analysis suggested that killing war workers in their homes was more efficient than destroying the factories where they worked. Factories could be rebuilt in months. Replacing skilled laborers required years. The deliberate targeting of civilian population centers represented a fundamental shift in American military doctrine. Total war, a concept America had condemned when practiced by Nazi Germany, had been adopted wholesale. The justification rested on two pillars. First, Japanese war production was genuinely dispersed throughout residential areas, making civilian military separation impossible. Second, Japan's refusal to surrender despite certain defeat meant that only total destruction of war-making capacity would end the conflict. Both arguments had merit. But they also revealed uncomfortable truths about industrialized warfare's evolution. The distinction between combatant and civilian had become meaningless. Strategic bombing had evolved from targeting military installations to targeting entire populations. Victory would go to whichever side could inflict suffering on an industrial scale. The development of incendiary tactics required extensive scientific research that academic institutions conducted with bureaucratic detachment. The Standard Oil Development Company created napalm by mixing naphthalene and palmitate, creating a gel that adhered to surfaces while burning intensely. Harvard University chemists refined the formula for maximum efficiency. The Dugway Proving Ground in Utah constructed replica Japanese neighborhoods, complete with authentic materials shipped from Tokyo, to test incendiary effectiveness. German and Japanese workers, recruited from internment camps, built the structures to exact specifications. American bombers then systematically burned these test villages while scientists measured temperature, spread rates, and combustion duration. The research was thorough and chilling. Engineers determined that M69 cluster bombs achieved optimal dispersion at 2,000 feet separation altitude. Chemists calculated that napalm gel burning at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit would ignite wood in under 3 seconds. Meteorologists identified wind conditions that would maximize firestorm development. The Manhattan Project receives historical attention for weaponizing atomic physics. The incendiary bombing campaign weaponized chemistry, meteorology, and urban planning with equal sophistication and greater immediate lethality. The human cost of the incendiary campaign exceeded 400,000 Japanese civilian dead by war's end. The physical destruction was equally staggering. 64 of Japan's largest cities were attacked, with 40% of their total urban area destroyed. Approximately 2.5 million buildings burned. 8 million people were rendered homeless. The March 10 Tokyo raid alone killed more people than the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, previously Japan's worst disaster. American air crews processed the moral weight of their actions in various ways. Some embraced the total war logic, arguing that every Japanese civilian contributed to the war effort and therefore qualified as legitimate targets. Others developed psychological defenses, focusing on technical aspects of their missions rather than human consequences. Many suffered quietly, the moral injury manifesting decades later. Captain Robert Morgan, who flew 26 combat missions including multiple incendiary raids, reflected in 1991, "We were told we were destroying military targets. We saw cities burning. We knew people were dying. But we were at war, and war means doing terrible things to prevent worse things. I still dream about the fires. I still wonder if we crossed a line. But I also remember Pearl Harbor, Bataan, the brutality of Japanese occupation. There were no good choices, only necessary ones." The Japanese government's response to the Firestorm campaign revealed a nation's death spiral. Initial civil defense measures proved completely inadequate. Fire breaks created by demolishing structures could not stop firestorm-level conflagrations. Evacuation plans collapsed under the scale of bombing. Emergency services were overwhelmed. By June 1945, the Home Ministry had essentially abandoned urban defense, instead encouraging mass evacuation to rural areas. Approximately 4 million civilians fled Japanese cities between March and August 1945, creating a refugee crisis that further strained Japan's collapsing economy. Agricultural production fell as evacuees overwhelmed rural infrastructure. Food distribution systems broke down. Caloric intake for average Japanese civilians dropped to near starvation levels. The strategic bombing campaign achieved what naval blockade alone could not, the complete disruption of Japanese society. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 are remembered as uniquely horrific. But the firebombing campaign killed 3 times as many people and destroyed far more infrastructure. The atomic bomb's significance lay not in their destructive power, which conventional incendiary raids matched or exceeded, but in their psychological impact and efficiency. What required 334 B-29s and 1,665 tons of conventional incendiaries to accomplish in Tokyo, a single atomic bomb achieved in Hiroshima. The American Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after Japan's surrender provided comprehensive analysis of the campaign's effectiveness. The conclusions were stark. Incendiary attacks destroyed 40% of the built-up area in 64 Japanese cities. Approximately 400,000 civilians died, 1.3 million were injured, 8.5 million were rendered homeless. War production declined by 50% between March and August 1945. Food production fell by 30%. Transportation systems collapsed. Most significantly, civilian morale reached a breaking point. Surveys indicated that over 70% of Japanese civilians believed the war was lost by June 1945, with strategic bombing cited as the primary reason. The will to resist had been incinerated along with the cities. The moral and legal implications of the incendiary bombing campaign remain contested. International law in 1945 was ambiguous regarding strategic bombing. The Hague Conventions prohibited attacks on undefended cities but did not clearly define what constituted defense or legitimate military targets. In practice, all belligerents in World War II engaged in strategic bombing of civilian areas. Britain's area bombing campaign against German cities killed approximately 600,000 civilians. German bombing of London, Rotterdam, and Warsaw deliberately targeted civilian morale. Japanese atrocities in China included extensive firebombing of cities. The firebombing of Japanese cities represented American participation in a terrible equilibrium where all sides had abandoned restraint. American justifications emphasized 3 points. First, Japan's refusal to surrender despite certain defeat meant that only maximum pressure would end the war. Second, Japanese war production's dispersal into residential areas made civilian-military separation impossible. Third, continuing the war would cost more lives, both American and Japanese, than the bombing campaign. These arguments had merit but also revealed uncomfortable truths. The United States had adopted total war methodology it had condemned in enemies. Strategic bombing had evolved from precision attacks on military targets to deliberate destruction of civilian population centers. The distinction between combatant and civilian had effectively vanished. The firebombing campaign's architects faced no war crimes prosecution. Curtis LeMay later remarked that if the United States had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal. His assessment was probably accurate. But Victor's justice meant that strategic bombing of civilians was retroactively legitimized as necessary to end the war quickly. The post-war strategic bombing survey's conclusions shaped American military doctrine for decades. The campaign had proven that air power alone could destroy an industrialized nation's capacity and will to fight. This belief would influence American strategy in Korea, Vietnam, and future conflicts, with mixed results. The M69 incendiary cluster bomb itself remained in American arsenals for decades, seeing use in Korea and Vietnam. The basic design proved so effective that it required little modification. Modern thermobaric weapons and incendiary munitions trace their conceptual ancestry to the 1943 Standard Oil laboratories that weaponized napalm. The veterans of the March 10 raid carried their experiences in silence for decades. Unlike European theater aircrews, who could frame their missions as liberating occupied peoples, Pacific theater crews had incinerated enemy civilians by the hundreds of thousands. Many suffered from what is now recognized as moral injury, psychological trauma from participating in actions that violate ethical beliefs. The March 10 raid represented the convergence of American industrial capacity, scientific innovation, and strategic ruthlessness. It demonstrated that democratic societies at total war could match or exceed authoritarian brutality when survival seemed at stake. The firestorm that consumed Tokyo was not an accident or excess. It was deliberate, calculated, and considered necessary by military planners who had concluded that only total destruction would force Japanese surrender. The human cost was approximately 100,000 dead in a single night, most of them women, children, and elderly, since able-bodied men were conscripted into military service. The ethical burden of that decision rests heavily on historical memory. In the ruins of Tokyo's Shitamachi district, where wooden neighborhoods had stood for centuries, lay an uncomfortable truth. Modern industrial warfare had reached a point where civilian populations could be destroyed as efficiently as military forces. The M69 incendiary cluster bomb, costing $1.80 to produce, had proven more strategically effective than any precision weapon. The mathematics of total war favored maximum destruction at minimum cost. The Japanese were not simply terrified when American incendiary bombs created firestorms. They were transformed by the revelation that their cities, their homes, their families were no longer protected by geography or defensive measures. The psychological impact proved as decisive as the physical destruction. By June 1945, the Japanese government understood that resistance meant watching every major city burn. The will to continue fighting had been incinerated along with the urban landscape. In the end, the greatest impact of the M69 incendiary cluster bomb was not the cities it destroyed but the doctrine it validated. Strategic bombing of civilian populations had proven militarily effective, economically efficient, and politically acceptable to democratic societies engaged in total war. This terrible lesson would echo through the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st. The firestorm that consumed Tokyo was not an aberration. It was an evolution. Modern warfare had reached its logical conclusion: victory would belong to whoever could inflict the most suffering the fastest. The thunder of thousands of incendiary bombs raining from night skies was industrial democracy's answer to imperial defiance. The M69 had spoken with the voice of total war, and its message was unmistakable. In modern conflict between industrial powers, there are no safe places, no protected populations, no limits to destruction. The age of restraint had ended in flames over Tokyo, and the world that emerged from those ashes would never forget the terrible efficiency of weaponized fire.